Welcome to Collars and Calluses, a working theology for young men, where grit meets grace and faith meets the workbench, where young men can come to learn how to grow in the strength, wisdom, and courage that God calls them to. In a world confused about manhood, we open God's Word and roll up our sleeves. We'll talk theology that's not just for the classroom, but for the job site, the gym, the family table, and the front lines of life. We are about forging biblical masculinity that works in the real world for real men to the glory of God. This is Collars and Calluses. Let's get to work. Thank you for joining us on this, our inaugural episode of Collars and Calluses. I am Bill Smith here with my co-host, Rich Lusk. We are just diving into the podcast scene together. We have been talking about issues of masculinity privately and publicly, writing about those things for quite some time, and we thought about writing a book together, but then also, and that might still happen, but we decided to go ahead and try to do some of these things in podcast form. One of the things that we want to do here is to help young men understand their masculine mission in God's kingdom and be equipped to put their hands to the work. Now, before we get into all the issues that come with this, we want to introduce ourselves, to give kind of our bona fides, I guess, about why we should be doing these things to begin with. So I want to begin introducing Rich Lusk, pastor, Trinity Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Rich, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, Bill, it's great to be with you. We have talked about doing something like this for a long time, and so we figured we'd give it a shot and see what happens. I have been the pastor of Trinity Presbyterian, which is a Series C congregation here in Birmingham, for just over 20 years. I've been in pastoral ministry of some sort for about 30 years, been married for about 30 years, and Jenny and I have 4 kids, 4 grown kids. We're grandparents. I've had a real interest in issues of masculinity and femininity really for as long as I can remember. When I was in college, I had a pastor who gave me a lot of reading to do in this particular area. I think he could see what was on the horizon and recognize that there's a disaster awaiting us, that we're not already there because of the sexual revolution. So I got interested in these issues and have been talking about them and speaking about them and preaching on them and writing about them for a long time now. And you've kind of been in the same boat, I think, Bill, as far as just your interest in these things. And we've talked about these things together a lot for a lot of years and decided to share some things that we've got, especially aimed at young men today.
Yeah. Rich and I have known one another since the early 2000s. So it's been a while when he finally came to God's country in Louisiana there, and we got to know one another. And then we both left God's country and went to the mission fields and other places.
So, I went to the Bible Belt. You went to a mission.
That's true. I went to the mission field. I'm in Southern Illinois now. I'm pastor of Cornerstone Reformed Church, another CREC congregation. I have been married for 35 years to my wife, Susan, and have 6 children, 4 boys, 2 girls, a number of grandchildren, and that seems to be increasing monthly. So don't have a fixed number at this point, but we're just continuing to grow. But yes, the issues of masculinity and femininity, those Rich has really kind of helped spur me on to those things. I even wrote some letters to my sons, which turned into letters to young men that are online. I know Rich has written many things. I know he's got some things that are unpublished that he's still working on, has been working on for years. So these issues are near and dear to our hearts, especially having raised sons, being pastors of churches where we have to counsel young men, whether it's premarital counseling or just in the daily battles of life for young men. So these issues, again, are very dear to us, and we do see a lot of challenges out there for young men, and that's why we wanted to move to this podcast format to start talking about these things. But before we do that, let me just give you our X handles so that you can find us on X. You're going to see that Rich is a lot more prolific on X than I am. I post every once in a while. I post mainly long form stuff. Rich posts quite a bit, but you can find me at WRS2_. You can also, if any of this stuff resonates with you or you have questions, you can direct message either me or Rich, and I'll let Rich tell you where you can find him.
Yeah, so on X, I am at Vicar 1973. So Vicar, Vicar 1973. You know you've got the right account when you see the dog and the Chevy square body truck.
Yes, the old Chevy. That's good.
And I'll mention this too. Bill loves Chevy, so that's why I mentioned that. You can find some of my writings and some of my speaking at tpcpastorspage.com. So we've got a church website, and then we've got a pastor's page. I've got a lot of sermons on the church website, which I know you do on your website as well, but a lot of sermons that address the issues that we're going to be talking about. But if you go to that pastor's page, tpcpastorspage.com, I've got more conference speaking I've done on this kind of thing. I've got a blog where I write about these things fairly frequently. I think the thing is, you and I both have skin in the game. We've raised sons, we've got sons-in-law, we've now got grandkids, we pastor a lot of young men. So Vicar 1973, you can tell that's the year I was born. So I'm kind of right smack dab in the middle of Gen X. The world has changed a lot over the course of my lifetime. And for men who are older than me, it's changed even more. But Bill, when you and I were growing up, I mean, obviously we were living in the wake of the sexual revolution, and you're already kind of seeing the bad fruit from that. And so you could kind of see the trajectory of where things were going. But when you and I were growing up, everybody knew which restroom to use. There was still something of a script for men and women to get together and to marry. You know, most of my good friends in college married right after college. So at least in Christian circles, the age of getting married was still young. And then people went on to buy a house, usually not too long after that. And now there are huge challenges to doing, exactly the kind of things we did. Getting married young, which I think is ideal in a lot of ways, building a family, buying a house, those kinds of things. It's just the world has changed. And I think that there's a lot of people who don't recognize the extent to which it has changed and the challenges that presents for young men in today's world. And you look at the culture today, we have got collapsing marriage rates, we've got collapsing birth rates, they've never been lower. That's a sign of a society that is sick. But more than that, you might even say it's a kind of genocide, and I mean, I think that's a real thing. Sexual revolution is a form of genocide. Feminism is a form of genocide. But it's not like somebody is doing this to us. We're doing it to ourselves. So really, you could say it's civilizational suicide, really.
Right.
There is so much at stake in this. It's not just that you and I as pastors want to see young men succeed. It's that in a very real way, people talk about an existential crisis or an existential threat. Well, there's a real existential crisis or existential threat to our civilization. And if men and women don't marry and don't have children and don't have property, civilization is.
Right.
And of course, we don't want to see that happen. We want to leave a certain kind of world to our children, to our grandchildren, to our great-great-grandchildren. And this podcast, Lord willing, will deal with the kind of issues that if young men can learn how to navigate those challenges, they can still see the creation mandate to be fruitful, to multiply, to rule over the earth, to have dominion. They can see the creation mandate come to fruition, come to fulfillment in their lives. And that's really what this is about. Even the name of this podcast indicates that. Collars and Calluses. You got the church, you got the collar part of it, and then you got the work part of it with the calluses. That's what this is. That's what this is about.
Yeah. And interestingly, the collars part of it can be multifaceted in a lot of ways, because white collars and blue collars, ministerial collars, you got all
not
those,
just clergy collars.
Right. But all of us have to put our hands to the work and get the calluses on our hands in some form or fashion, because we got to get to plowing. We've got to get to work. I'm not saying women don't have challenges today. They certainly do, but this is not the focus here. We're focusing on young men and their challenges, and every generation has had its challenges. We're not the World War II generation where we have that challenge, but we have a very different challenge. And in every generation, men have had the challenge that has been put before them by God in his providence to rise up and do what they need to do. But the first thing you need to do is understand what the challenge is. We are not the World War II generation.
Well, so let me say a couple of things about what you just said, 'cause that's really good. I think the challenges for women are just as great. And that is because people talk about the battle of the sexes. And that's a very real thing in our culture, where there should be mutual cooperation and admiration and, of course, attraction between the sexes. That's being weakened in our day. And what you have instead is sexual rivalry between men and women. You don't have to be online for long, and you can find lots of short clips online and longer form things online where men are complaining about women today and women are complaining about men. And that is, again, a sign that something has really gone wrong. And in the battle of the sexes, if you think of it that way, there can be no winners because you can't have one sex win while the other loses. The sexes stand or fall together. We win or lose together.
Right.
What's good for young men will ultimately be good for young women and vice versa. And I think young women have been lied to just as much as young men and have been led astray. So occasionally we'll touch on issues that are pertinent to young women. That's not the focus of this podcast, but young men need to understand what's going on with women as well and why things are the way they are so they can do something about it. Don't think in terms of a war between the sexes. Think of a war on sex, on God's design for the sexes. That's really the war that's being waged. There's a war against masculinity, there's a war against femininity, and there's a war against everything that would bring them together, because bringing them together, especially in the covenant of marriage, is right at the heart of God's plan for creation and history. It's right at the heart of God's plan for His church and for our happiness. And so when that design is under attack, when God's sexual design is under attack, everybody loses. So it's not men against women who can win, but it's God's design against Satan's perversion. And we want to see God's side win. Ultimately, of course, God's side will. That's what we want to see, is young men embracing God's design, figuring out how to fulfill that design under the current set of challenges, which, as Bill pointed out, Bill, you're exactly right about this. Those challenges are different than what were faced in other generations. If you were 18 years old in 1914, or 18 years old in 1942, or 18 years old in 1969, you had challenges, but the challenges were very different than what you would face as an 18-year-old in 2025. And so that's what we want to get at.
Yeah, absolutely. All these challenges have a genesis and a beginning. And of course, the original Genesis is in Genesis with the battle between the serpent, the woman, her seed, his seed. But our modern day challenges begin, we think, with the waves of feminism that started coming. And there have been particularly like 3 or 4 waves of feminism. And we want to talk about that and that particular challenge. Excuse me, while I clear my throat, can you go ahead and talk about
Yeah. So think about some of the challenges in the wake of feminism. It's really important to understand. We can talk about different waves of feminism, but it's really important to understand feminism was bad from the start. It was demonic from the start. And I think some people want to try to rescue the earlier waves of feminism and say, oh, they weren't so bad and they were correcting certain injustices and that kind of thing. It's a complicated narrative for sure when you start talking about the phases of feminism or the waves of feminism, that kind of thing. But it's important to understand from the very beginning, feminism impacted both men and women. It was not just a women's movement, but it had a huge impact on men as well. And it's important to understand how it has changed both men and women. If you wanted to put that in a nutshell, I would say what feminism has done is it has masculinized women and it has feminized men. And so it has what really drives attraction between the sexes. And this is something we're going to come back and talk about at much greater length later on. What drives attraction between the sexes is polarity. It's the differences. Right. Women are attracted to masculinity. Men are attracted to femininity and all of its physical and psychological expressions. And when you kill that polarity, you kill attraction between the sexes. And so it's no wonder the sexes have a really hard time bonding in a feminist world where men have been feminized and women have been masculinized. But feminism has also had a huge impact on the economy and the way society is structured. It's had huge implications for our politics. It's had all kinds of downstream implications. The mantra of feminists today is smash the patriarchy. Okay, well, fathers have always been the target of the feminist ire. There's different meanings that can go with that term. What we mean by that term is basically that a man is the head of his household. You can substitute the word headship for patriarchy, and that's what we're talking about, that a man is the head of his household. He's responsible for his household, and he has authority over his household. And again, these are things we'll unpack at greater length in future episodes, but that's the essence of what the patriarchy is. And that's what feminism has tried to smash, is that whole idea that a man has a special authority over his home and a special responsibility for his home. And so feminism has really waged a war on fatherhood, on marriage, on the family. And the sad thing is that in our culture, right at this very moment, you can say it's largely won. Now, the war never ends. So part of this what we're doing in this podcast is fighting back and trying to take that territory for God's design and the patriarchy and headship and that kind of thing. But it's really important to understand what's happened and how to navigate those particular challenges. Fatherlessness is a huge component of this. Now, I had the great privilege of growing up in a faithful Christian home with a wise Christian father, so that was a great benefit to me. But you have a whole generation now, because the sexual revolution detached sex from marriage and ultimately detached procreation from marriage. Now you have this crisis, really, of fatherlessness. You have boys who have grown up in entirely feminized environments, even if they had a dad. Maybe he wasn't a very engaged or involved dad. And so fatherlessness is a huge part of this. We've got a whole generation of men now who are underfathered and overmothered. So they grew up in public schools, or and in many cases, even Christian schools or homeschool environments that were dominated by feminine norms and feminine sensibilities, places where masculine qualities were not welcomed, where masculinity was branded as toxic, where those feminine sensibilities were privileged in certain kinds of ways, where everything's female coded, really. It's female normed space. And of course, it's fine for there to be female normed spaces in places where they belong. But when boys grow up in those kinds of spaces and don't get to enter into masculine spaces, which again, masculine space is something we'll talk about in future episodes, it's really, really destructive. We've seen masculine spaces taken away. And so today you got a lot of boys who have grown up and they have no vision for what masculinity is, no sense of a masculine mission that's been given to them. If anything, they're often ashamed of their masculinity. Right. And that's a huge problem. That's part of what we want to address here.
Yeah, and the fatherlessness, that means they have no examples. They have no examples of what it means to be a man. They've been taught by women what it means to be a man. And women and in this area are deficient teachers because they don't know what it means to be a man, generally speaking. Now, speaking of the challenges, going back to the challenge of feminism, and I think this is important to understand, and I think this is one of those areas where we want to encourage young men, is because I think even though feminism was driven hard, of course, by women and rebellious women, and women can be rebellious. You can see the harlot folly in Proverbs, and you can see a number of rebellious women throughout the scriptures. Women can sin. It's not like it's all men's fault in the sense of they cause women to sin. But each wave of feminism, if you want to use that terminology, each wave of feminism was a challenge to men to stand up and do what was right. And that is to exert their God-given place, not in a tyrannical way, but in a way that corrected this feminism. And men didn't do it. We are suffering, I think, we are suffering from the effects of feminism, and we're living in this gynocentric mentality and culture, as you talked about, with the feminine norm, because men haven't stepped up and
Bill, let me jump in there. You use the term gynocentric. Explain that term for us.
Yeah, gynocentric is that the woman is the measure of all things. She and everything, whether it's her feelings or her mission, everything is centered around what women want and how they feel. And so they are also the measure of what relationships ought to look like. Men ought to relate to other men like women relate to women. They don't understand. You can see these kinds of jokes online. Comedians make hay out of this. I heard this story one time where a man was asked by his wife, he'd been playing golf with this guy for 5 years. And his wife asked him, said, "Do you know his children's names?" "No." And so he went to his golf buddy and he asked him, "Can you name my children?" He said, "I can rename them." But women expect us to talk about our feelings. They expect us to do these things. And this is the norm. And what you were talking about, public schools and even homeschools, like you said, boys are expected to sit and learn like girls. They're expected to act like girls. And if they don't, they get drugged up and have to be subdued. Their masculinity has to be subdued.
Yeah. So think about it. Aristotle said that a woman is a defective man, and he was wrong about that.
Right.
Men have masculine glory. Women are designed for a kind of feminine glory. There's nothing defective about either sex. But in today's world, it's as if men are treated like defective women.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. You talked about how every wave of feminism was a new test for men because there was some new element added to it. I think that's exactly right. This is how I put it before. Feminism was a civilization-wide test for men that men had failed.
Right.
So sometimes women will test men. I'm sure this is something we'll get into in the future as well. It's something that men need to understand, how women have certain ways of testing men. And that can be a bad thing or a good thing, depending on how it's done. But there's a reason why women will sometimes
Yes.
put men to the test in various ways, because they need to know what a man's made of. And a woman wants to know, she wants to find out very quickly, can this guy stand up to me? Because if he can't stand up to me, he certainly can't stand up for me. And she doesn't want to be married to a wimp, to a soft man. But feminism was a civilizational wide test, and men continually accommodated themselves to feminist demands. And that is at the root of our disaster. So you can talk about, well, who's to blame for feminism? Obviously, women themselves were rebelling against God's design. And yes, women do sin. Sometimes that surprises people to say that. Women do sin, but men sin too. And one of the ways men sinned is just really interesting. In Genesis chapter 3, when God comes to Adam after he has sinned, God says, because you listened to your wife, because you hearkened to the voice of your wife, you heeded the voice of your wife. So Adam listened to his wife when he should have stood up to her.
Right.
In a very real way, you can say the original sin of Adam in the garden was effeminacy. He should have crushed the serpent's head. He should have told his wife no. Instead, he gave in to her demands. The same thing happens in Genesis chapter 16. Abraham listens to his wife, Sarah, when she says, hey, you know what? God hasn't given us a child yet. Why don't you sleep with my maidservant Hagar, and we'll raise up the promised seed through her? Well, that's a bad idea. That was a bad plan. Abraham should have said, no, Sarah, we're not doing that. We're waiting on God to give us this child, no matter how long it takes. I know that you're way past childbearing age. I know that, but we're still going to wait on God to do what he promised. Instead, Abraham gives in. He listens to his wife. And you've got men today, and this is sometimes put in slogans like happy wife, happy life, where they think their job is basically to say yes to their wife at all times. Or servant leadership often works this way. Leadership is cast as the way that you lead is by giving everybody who's supposed to be under your authority exactly what they want. So then, but you're not really a leader at that point. You're actually just a yes man. But that's how a lot of men understand servant leadership and how they understand their role as husbands. I'm just supposed to give my wife whatever she wants all the time. There's no sure recipe for having a miserable wife than a husband who always says yes to her and always gives her what she says she wants and always gives in to her every demand or whim or emotional, whatever she's feeling in the moment. That is a disaster. I think another way you see this is in a lot of marriage counseling, and this is true in the church as well as outside of the church. Husband and wife are having troubles in their marriage. They go and they sit down with a counselor, and I've seen this happen in conservative churches, okay? Very, very conservative churches that would say they believe in the man's headship. They would pay lip service to that. But when the husband and wife sit down with a counselor, her expectations are considered the norm. And it's not whether or not he has done a good job loving her according to this objective standard of God's word. It's whether or not she feels loved. And so her feelings become the standard by which he is judged. You mentioned living in a gynocentric society. Another term for that is the longhouse. That's one that gets thrown around. Same idea that feminine, it doesn't mean to talk about a gynocentric order or the longhouse does not mean that women run everything, because obviously that's not true. Obviously, men still generally hold positions of leadership in our institutions. But the gynocracy or the longhouse requires men to abide by feminine norms and feminine expectations in places where they don't really belong or fit. So politics is a great example of this. A woman's maternal instinct doesn't go away, even if she doesn't have children. That maternal instinct can get brought into places where it doesn't really belong, like politics. Next thing you know, you've got the nanny state that takes care of everybody, or you've got in youth sports leagues, you've got participation. Everybody gets a trophy. That's that maternal instinct coming into places where it doesn't belong. Boys need to learn competition. They're winners and losers. That's part of growing into a man, is recognizing that. And sometimes a man needs to lose on his way to manhood. So
it makes him better. And one of the things about sin, of course, or what sin is a perversion of a righteous quality. And one of the things in men that they long to see is women happy. They want to give women everything that they need, and they want to see a woman happy. They want to see her enjoy herself. She is his glory. But sin comes in and perverts that and thinks, and like you were talking about, it is the servant leadership which translates into capitulation to everything she wants. And so the goal of making the woman happy is short-circuited because they misunderstand and pervert the way that because a woman tells, I'll be happy if you do this for me. I'll be happy if you do that. And what she's really wanting, and well, again, you mentioned the tests. What she's really wanting is strong masculine leadership, whether or not she says it consciously or it's a
What she was
subconscious.
designed for.
Yeah, it's just what she was designed for. And so that's what's going to make her happy. Now, so the feminists have lied, and you can see this all online if you go, whether any kind of social media, TikTok or whatever, these women get online and you can say, what happened to all the good men? What happened? I partied through my 20s. I'm in my 30s. Where are the men? Or I built my career and now I have nobody. I'm alone. What's going on? I was told that this would be fulfilling. And they've been lied to. Of course, men have been lied to as well, because the reaction to feminism, especially in the last 20, 25 years, has been the manosphere. And I say that in general because I know that many people have defined it in different ways depending on who's doing what.
Bill, give us your definition of the manosphere, because I think that's important. Because this is the thing, and this is why I want to hear you talk about it. In a cultural situation where there's so much fatherlessness, where so many men don't have guides, they don't have pastors, they don't have fathers who are guiding them. So much of this used to be folk wisdom that was passed along from one generation to the next. And then that chain, the links in the chain, it got broken somewhere along the way because of feminism and the sexual revolution. And so now you've got men, young men now, who are looking for guides, who are looking for someone to teach them what their father and or pastor should have taught them. They're looking for guides. They're looking for substitute fathers. Talk about the manosphere and how it's difficult.
Yeah, and the manosphere, the origins of it are kind of diverse in a lot of ways, but it really started with a lot of recognizing the dangers of feminism. That's one of the things, but also
it's called the manosphere because it's mainly online. This is an internet phenomenon.
It's an internet phenomenon because when it started with a lot of pickup artists, PUAs, and they recognized the polarity you were talking about earlier. And what was true 5 minutes ago is now not true. And they're saying, no, wait a minute. No, women, this is what women really want. And they started using those in perverse ways but they started chatting with one another, talking with one another, kind of a dark web type thing, because they would use aliases, and they still do, some of them. And they didn't want to be doxxed. They all started talking on the dark web. But all this stuff started coming to light, started having these conferences, things like that, talking about really the intersexual dynamics. But it then it went to, of course, like everything does, it has a web. And so it starts talking about how men are to operate in general relationships and men's spaces and all these types. It dealt with masculinity. And so these guys who had been soaked in feminism for so many years and have been lied to, realizing, for instance, okay, if you're just the Mr. Nice Guy, every woman's looking for this Mr. Nice Guy. And if you're that guy, then women are going to be falling all over you. And they were lied to because women hated that. They hated it. They hated the lack of leadership and things like that. And they started realizing, wait a minute, these guys are onto something.
I can remember, I'm going to interject here really quickly. And I don't want you to lose your train of thought, because I want you to continue with this. But I can remember, I was probably in like 6th grade, just kind of where you're at that age and you really start to notice girls and that kind of thing. And it's also where, if you're growing up in youth group, they start to talk about boy, girl, male, female kind of stuff. I can remember in a Bible study with a bunch of other guys, a youth pastor telling us, you really need to be sensitive. That was the word he used. And there was this whole sensitive male thing in the 1980s. It was exactly this. Today we would call them simps. You call them nice guys. That's a nicer way to put it, but they're simps. I remember even then in 6th grade thinking to myself, like, I grew up with a brother, no sisters, but I had observed enough female behavior by that point. I remember thinking, I'm not sure that's true. Like, that doesn't resonate. They seem to go, that's not who they seem to be talking about and who they seem to be attracted to. It's not the nice guys. It's what would be called alpha. I didn't have this terminology at the time, of course, but alpha male, like the guy who may not always be so sensitive, but he is masculine and he has a mission and he knows what he's about. And he's got, and to some degree, there's good and bad forms of this, but it's sort of like, I don't care what anybody thinks kind of thing,
Right.
It's the rebel without a cause or something, or rebel with a cause, whatever. It's that kind of thing. So I remember even then, at that early age, being suspicious of what I was being told. Now, of course, I also thought, well, I mean, like, he's the youth pastor, surely he knows. But the more I observed things, the more I realized I don't think that's actually true.
Yeah, yeah, because it's the guy who throws the rocks at the girl or who doesn't pay attention to her at all is the one that she really likes, and it's the guy who brings her flowers and candy, trying to win her that
He
she,
falls all over himself
yeah,
to try to win her. Yeah, that
yeah,
she's not
and
interested.
she's not interested. There's a perfect illustration of this. This is interesting because when was Gone with the Wind made? Like 1936 or something like that.
Yeah, 36 or 39.
Yeah, one of the opening scenes, Scarlett O'Hara, she's in the middle of like 10 guys who are just fawning all over her. And I watched this with my children, and she is just completely repulsed by all those guys. They will do anything for her. She's completely repulsed, but she wants the guy who doesn't want her.
Right.
And then she eventually goes for the bad boy, Rhett Butler, who just tells her what she needs to do. And it's an amazing thing. Again, it's just one of those dynamics that people just knew years ago that was just a part of life
Yeah.
and the folk wisdom you were talking about. And the manosphere tried to recover that, but they had evolutionary psychology and it went off and it's certainly gone off. It has no moral bearings because it's not rooted and grounded in scripture. It's just
Right. But let me interject something else
yeah.
here because these are important categories. Okay. So there's two, and I didn't come up with this. I don't know who did, but I've seen it used by others. So it's not original with me. But you can be a good man and you can be good at being a man. So
Right.
the good man is the virtuous man, okay? The man who
Right.
does the right thing, like who seeks to obey God in his life. And then you have being good at being a man, which is the man who's got masculine skills, competencies,
Right.
take dominion. What we're aiming at in this podcast is to develop young men who are good men who are also good at being men. And I would say, actually, you're not really a good man if you're not good at being a man.
Right.
There's an artificial separation of those categories to make a point. You're not really a good man unless you're good at being a man. You can be good at being a man and be a bad man.
Right.
But if you're going to be a good man, you've also got to be good at being a man. And that's really what we're aiming at here. And we're going to talk about those two categories in future episodes and what they mean and how they relate and what it means to be a good man who's good at being a man.
Yeah, and unfortunately, though, you have to use those categories because even in the broad evangelical church, well, I would think just in the American church, Western church, across denominational lines, you have good men defined differently. Yeah. I believe they are defined by that, the longhouse or the gynocentric society, feminism, things like that. And so
you talked about feminism makes the woman the measure of all things. To be a good man, it means to be a good man according to God's standard.
Exactly.
And a woman in her created nature, she was made to respond to masculinity.
Yes.
In her fallen nature, she will go after the bad man who's still good at being a man.
Right.
Okay. But again, if she wants to be a virtuous woman, she is going to want a good man who is good at being a man. She's going to want both sides of that. And that's really important to see.
Yeah. And like you said, we're going to be talking about a lot of these issues later on. But when she sees a guy, for instance, he's got purpose, he's got a mission, and he is dog determined to do what he's going to do. He's that alpha male and he's going to do what he's going to do. She is by creation's design attracted to that because she is made to be a helper. She wants to help. And of course, sin perverts all this stuff. And so she sees this guy. She said, oh, he's got purpose. He could be broke. It doesn't matter, but he's got a purpose. And she says, I want to be with him. Now, of course, she also
she'll wait in a car while he robs a gas station.
Exactly.
I mean, because he has a mission. Now, obviously, and that's the fallenness coming to expression. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that is happening. And that's why a lot of, I would say, young men who have been misled. When I sit down with a young man today, I basically, like, when we get to this topic, there's two things I emphasize. One is mission before marriage, which again is something we'll talk about later on. A man needs to find his mission in life before he gets a wife, just like God gave Adam a job and then gave him a wife. So that's one thing. But the other thing is to recognize that probably everything that you were told, especially if you grew up in the church, probably everything you were told about intersexual dynamics, that is the interrelationship between the sexes with a romantic purpose and aiming at marriage ultimately, everything you were taught about intersexual dynamics was probably wrong. And you need to unlearn that so you can learn the truth.
Yes, absolutely. And that's, again, we're hoping to ground these things in solid biblical principles and theology so you'll understand what it means to be a man, act like a man, and relate to women the way God designed us to relate to women. Now, we've talked about it, and we're going to try to be keeping these podcasts to about 45 minutes so that we're not taking up your whole day. We've talked about those challenges of feminism, the masculine influencers, which fatherless men are attracted to because they need some type of mentorship. And we want you to stay away from those guys like Andrew Tate and even Rollo Tomasi, Richard Cooper, and those types of guys, because they're really, a lot of them are discouraging God's purpose for you as a man.
They may say some things that are true, but it's in a godless context, and it's not going to serve you well.
Exactly.
Listen, you need better voices. Again, you need good men who are good at being men to guide you along. I talked about how the manosphere has kind of become the substitute father for a lot of young men. I'd put Jordan Peterson in that category too. Jordan Peterson he's a real mixed bag, not a believer, but has done a lot of work on the Bible. And I think he has some insights too. But one thing he said that I thought was, or just one observation I've got, and this was really, I mean, Peterson I think his star has faded a good bit.
Yeah.
But one thing that I noticed when he was sort of at the zenith of his popularity is, and this is an example I've used many times, Peterson, think about it this way. Moms have been telling boys to make up their beds for years, and boys would kind of roll their eyes at that. Mom wants a clean room. She wants a clean house. That's her goal in that. A young man, doesn't really care all that much about that. And so hopefully the young man would obey, but he's just not that interested in it. Okay. But then Jordan Peterson comes along and he says, make your bed, start off every day making your bed. And young men act like this is the most profound life advice they've ever been given. But the reason is this: it's because Jordan Peterson attached that rule to make your bed every morning to your life's mission and purpose. He attached it to something distinctively masculine, because men have to have a mission. And so now making your bed is part of bringing order out of the chaos of the world. And as a man, that's what you're called to do, to take dominion, to rule. And that dominion starts with your own life. You got to have dominion over yourself before you can take dominion of the world. You got to bring order to your own life and personal space before you can bring order to the world. And so what moms were trying to get their boys to do that they were totally uninterested in, all of a sudden becomes something they are interested in, because they recognize, oh, wow, this ties in with something larger. This is part of my created purpose, to take dominion in God's world and to bring order, to subdue the world. So I'm going to start each day. So even if I don't accomplish anything else tangible the rest of the day, I will at least have done that. I will at least have one little place where I brought order out of the chaos and where I subdued something, even if it's just that simple. So yeah, I think that's hugely important. Anything else about the manosphere? Is
not much else about the manosphere. I think, as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, there have been challenges for men for time immemorial. We've always had our challenges, and our most recent feminism and the masculine influencers. But what's at root in all of our challenges is that men have an inner challenge as well. And that inner challenge, I believe, is sloth. And sloth is not merely sitting around on the couch all day. It could express itself that way. Sloth can be very busy as well. You can be doing a lot of things and be a sloth, because sloth is not doing what you are supposed to do, not fulfilling your responsibilities. And I think in today's world, especially with everything being so easy to attain in some ways, in that you don't have to work for things. You don't have to work. In our society, you really don't have to work for money. The government will give you money. You were talking about the nanny state earlier. The government will give you money. You don't really have to work for sex in one way, because you got pornography. So you don't have to work for a woman. And by the way, you could go into all the other perversions of the robots, all this kind of stuff, and where you don't have to deal with a real woman.
Let me jump in on something there, because again, what you said is so important. We tend to think of pornography as a lust problem, which it is. And Jesus told you what to do with lust, put it to death. But it's also a laziness problem.
Yes.
It is not just a lust problem, it's a laziness problem. It's the sin of the sluggard expressed sexually. He doesn't want to put in the work to actually find a woman, marry her, and build a family with her. He wants to take a shortcut. And that's what the sluggard, the sloth, is always looking for, a shortcut. That's absolutely a huge issue.
Which is
And
interesting, time back into the manosphere, is because those guys, even we used to say when I was growing up, even a blind hog can find an acorn every once in a while. The manosphere guys are very much against pornography. Even they see the devastating effects it has on a man and his mission, things like that. So, like I said, don't get a lot of things right, but it's very interesting that they see that.
Well, they understand that pornography is emasculating. By the way, Bill, I grew up in the suburbs, so we would say a blind squirrel finds a nut every once in a while, not a blind hog. But yeah, I mean, they understand that pornography is emasculating. For a man who uses pornography, it might feel good and thrilling in the moment, but then there's that sense that I have emasculated myself, and there's a sense of shame that comes with that. And I think that is I call pornography a man killer. It's a masculinity killer.
It is.
And some people compare pornography to a drug because it's so highly addictive. And I think that's right. There are drugs that just make you kind of spaced out and zoned out, so you can't really do anything. Okay. Even weed, weed especially maybe does this. You just kind of zone out and you can't take dominion in that state. Pornography has the same effect. I think it was Doug Wilson who said, civilization is built by men who have families to feed.
Yes.
And Camille Paglia, who is a feminist and lesbian, not a Christian, but she said something very similar, that when a man, so you think about how the sexual revolution decoupled sex from marriage. So now men can get sex without having to take on all the responsibilities of a household and providing for a family and all of that. And of course, pornography sets the bar even lower in a lot of cases. Men are inspired by female beauty.
Yes.
And men will do whatever it takes. And this is how God made us. And one problem we see in our society today is that we have demonized and pathologized the male sex drive. But men have really strong sex drives, not by accident, but by design. That's how God made it. But God also made us and designed things to, when they're working properly, a man really does have to work in order to have sex, in order to get a wife and build a family and then have sexual intimacy with her regularly in marriage. And so when you make it easier for men to get sex, they underachieve. I don't know if you're familiar with J.D. Unwin's work, Sex and Civilization. I don't remember that's ever anything we talked about, but his work, Sex and Civilization, he basically says there is this tie between monogamous marriage and the energy it takes to build civilization. That when you have a culture that prizes and prioritizes and reinforces God, and he doesn't put it in these terms, but God's design of monogamous marriage, men have energy to pour themselves out into building civilization. The warning in Proverbs 31 to the man is, do not waste your strength on women. Okay. When you waste your strength on women, and that means the immoral pursuit of women, what happens is you don't have strength to build civilization. And so we have a lot of men today of various ages, not just young men, but of wide ranging ages, who are underachievers, and they are underachievers because in their own personal lives, they have not been sexually disciplined. We need to recover chastity as a masculine virtue. That sexual self-control, sexual self-discipline is a masculine virtue. And it is very much tied to a man's purpose in terms of taking dominion, building civilization, taking the talents he's been given by God and multiplying them. Really important to see that connection.
Well, we're going to have to wrap this up, but we have a lot of enemies out there. We talked about them, the feminism, the masculine influencers, but we have the enemy within as well. We have sloth. We have that tendency toward that. We have to recognize our enemies. We have to name them. We have to understand who they are, how they operate. One of the things in Proverbs that you see is that Solomon is always teaching his son how harlot folly operates. He's telling him, look, this is what she does. This is how she does it. So you have to know your enemies. You have to know what you're facing, your challenges, but you can never use them for excuses. They can never be an excuse for sin. They can never be an excuse not to be the man that God called you to be. You have to get to work. You have to do the work. You have to resist where it needs to be resisted. You need to pursue what needs to be pursued. That's what it means to be a man. And
It is.
go ahead.
Yeah, it's hard to be a good man,
It is.
especially in the culture in which we live. It
It's
is
going,
hard, and,
it,
and yet it is necessary. Our culture needs nothing more than good men who are good at being men, and that is not easy to do.
it's
Let
going to
me
take work.
let me wrap this up on my side,
Okay.
and then I'll get the last word, Bill. Just a
Okay.
few things I want to throw out there to kind of give our audience a taste of what is to come. We are going to talk about Proverbs a good bit. We'll talk about a bunch of other things that flow out of Proverbs and all of that. But the basic framework we have is the creation mandate of Genesis chapter 1. So think about when God creates man, male and female, in his image. He tells man, he gives this commissioning, this blessing: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. That's one side of it. Rule, subdue, have dominion. That's the other side of it. So to break it down, you basically have the multiplication side of the creation mandate, and you have the dominion side of the creation mandate. And obviously, men and women are both involved in both sides of that mandate.
Right.
You can't separate it out. Men and women need one another to fulfill the mandate, and they're both involved in both sides of the mandate. But women are more given to the multiplication side of the mandate. That's obvious biologically. They're the ones who bear children. That's where the curse lands on them in Genesis 3. That's what Paul commands women to do in passages like Titus chapter 2. Men are more given to the dominion side of the mandate.
Right.
That's where the curse falls on him. If a man doesn't provide for his family, he's worse than an unbeliever. Camille Paglia said, if women ruled, we'd still be living in grass huts, because men are the builders of civilization. So the question then is, what does it mean to fulfill that creation mandate in a fallen world? Well, from the man's point of view, the creation mandate is basically about two things. It's about your work, that's dominion, and about your wife, that's multiplication. The book of Proverbs is basically about the young man's work and wife.
Right.
It's about how to fulfill the creation mandate in a fallen world. It's wisdom about how to fulfill the creation mandate in a fallen world. So it's wisdom about work and wife. Now, you can take the book of Psalms and add to that worship. So what is life really about? It's about worship, work, and wife. If you're a young man, those are the categories you need to think in terms of. So that's absolutely crucial. You also need to understand, if you are a young man, you are a patriarch in training, which means you're a king, you're a head in training. The book of Proverbs is written to the king's son. He's a prince, he's a king in training. Okay? As a young man, you may not be a king in a political sense, but you're going to be a patriarch. You're going to be the king of your home. And you need to be training now to prepare yourself for that rule. And you need to understand that in the culture, feminism is trying to smash the patriarchy. Okay, well, if you smash the patriarchy, what replaces the patriarchy? Well, in Genesis chapter 3, it's really important to understand, when Adam was effeminate in Genesis chapter 3, he didn't lead his wife. He was led by her. He didn't crush the serpent's head. He allowed the serpent to deceive his wife. He didn't feed his wife. He received the sacramental food from her. In all these ways, it's topsy-turvy. But what is actually happening? It's not that patriarchy gets replaced with feminism. It's not that the man doesn't lead, so now the woman will. Actually, the alternative to patriarchy is Satanarchy. Instead of the rule of the man, you have the rule of Satan, because Satan actually becomes her leader. And the way 2 Corinthians describes this, when she took the food from Satan, that was like having sex with the serpent. It was communion. It was spiritual adultery. And Adam stood by, let's just say it, he was a cuck. He watched all this. He watches his wife fornicate with Satan. He watches his wife spiritually commit adultery against him and against God. And so the alternative to patriarchy is not feminism or some kind of egalitarianism or something like that. The alternative to patriarchy is Satanarchy. So those are the only two choices. Either you as a man will rule your house, or Satan will rule your house. The wife ruling the house is not an option.
Right.
Because that's just contrary to God's design. It's just impossible. So it's either the man rules his house under Christ, or Satan rules the house. So that's the fundamental alternative. And we've got to understand this. And so that means for you as a young man, where does Proverbs start? Proverbs starts with the fear of God. And you have to have the fear of God in your heart. That's the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom about work and wife and worship starts with the fear of God. And if your parents, you were raised in a Christian home and your parents disciplined you when they used the rod, what they were trying to do is put the fear of God in your heart. That's really what it's about. But this is what's so important. Go to Psalm 128. Psalm 128 describes the blessed family of the blessed man. And how does it start? Blessed is the man who fears the Lord. The reason he has this family, that reflects God's wise creational design is because he fears God. What so many husbands do today, this is the gynocracy, this is the longhouse, this is feminism, this is the sexual revolution, this is egalitarianism at work. So many men today, instead of fearing God, they fear their wives. And that is, I think it's an epidemic in the church. Wife-fearing men instead of God-fearing men. That's where you get the simp. That's where you get the nice guy syndrome, that kind of thing. The antidote to, say you're married and you realize, I've been a simp. I've been doing the happy wife, happy life thing instead of being about my mission and then including my wife as my helper in that. The answer is not to get angry with your wife. The answer is to learn how to fear God. It starts with the fear of God. Stop fearing your wife, start fearing God, and things in your life will fall into place. If you're not married yet, this is what you've got to be learning, is how to fear God. That's where it begins.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to be expounding on. There's a lot of information there, and we're going to unpack that through Proverbs. But also along the way, you are welcome to send questions to us. It doesn't always have to be on masculinity. Let me just say, we're seasoned pastors. And so we're
not perfect men, for sure.
Not perfect
men. We are seasoned. We have the gray in our beards to prove it.
And I have much more gray
hairlines to prove it.
That's right. So we're both in our 50s. So we've been around the block just a little bit, and we can't answer every question. We don't know the answers to all the questions, but they don't have to be questions about specifically masculine issues or whatever. But if you have theological questions, we're happy to at least field those. Maybe we'll bring those up on the podcast at times, and you can DM either one of us on X. We gave you those handles. If you're an old soul, even in a young body, you can message us on Facebook, or if you're really old soul in a young body, you can email us at collarsandcalluses@gmail.com. Just spell it out, collars and calluses. If you don't know how to spell calluses, you're just going to have to go look that up. Grok will help you probably.
And if you're a really, really, really old soul, you can write us at our P.O. box.
That's right. like Billy Graham. Just send it to Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And something like that. Bill Smith, Carbondale, and it'll get to me probably. Anyway, but just, contact us any way that you feel comfortable with, or you can, and we'll be happy to field those questions along the way and hopefully maybe work them in somehow to what we're doing in Proverbs, our plan for this whole podcast. We hope that you continue to join us. We are glad that you are here, and we want to help. We know that there's a need out there. And so hopefully our podcast will not just be another piece of noise, but it will meet a need. And
there are challenges young men face. Obviously, maybe we're not as aware of those challenges as if we were young men, as young men themselves are. But the masculine thing to do is to name the challenge and then rise above it. Name the challenge, meet it, overcome it. And
absolutely.
That's what we do.
Absolutely. Now, again, thank you for joining us. And now get to work.